Okay, I think you know what this is and what week is coming up. Alright. This, the story of the first Thanksgiving is a familiar one, at least to those of us in the United States. Hi everybody, welcome to another episode of Fun with Maps. I'm your host, Dan Hansen. This episode's map is a very small area, but it's timely for Thanksgiving week. So you know about the Pilgrims. They sailed on the Mayflower. They landed at Plymouth Rock in what is now the state of Massachusetts. We're going to look at where exactly that happened and some of the things that surrounded and why they did that. Now, there's a lot of stories about Thanksgiving. You've heard them. The first one likely happened between September and November of 1621. Very little is actually known specifically about the event. There's only two written accounts of it, and one was by Edward Winslow. He wrote a letter. He was an eyewitness. He was there. He wrote a letter in 1621, and he was one of the people on the Mayflower who founded Plymouth Colony in Massachusetts. And the other was the Plymouth governor, 1621, William Bradford, wrote of the event. But that was about almost 20 years after he wrote about it, after the feast itself. So about 50 colonists attended. There's like 22 men, 4 married women, and about 25 kids. There were so few women because so many of them died on the voyage over there. Disproportionately, the women died on coming over on the Mayflower. So they were lucky ones who made it through. It was a rough entry into the New World. It was a harsh winter. There were diseases sweeping through. Like 78% of the women on the Mayflower died during the first winter. And that was, higher percentage than any of the men or children. So not only were they celebrating the harvest that first Thanksgiving, like they traditionally did when they were back in England, but they were also celebrating the fact that, hey, we survived our first year here. We're alive here in New England. So there were probably twice as many, 90 or 100 of Native Americans, Indians there. Let me read what Winslow wrote about that. He says, "Many of the Indians coming amongst us, and among the rest their greatest king, Massasoit, with some 90 men. Massasoit is the leader of the Pokanoket Wampanoag, a local Native American society that had begun dealing with the colonists earlier in 1621. So both the Native Americans and the British had this tradition of giving thanks for the successful fall harvest. So that's how they got together for this. And you may have heard of Squanto, maybe in class or in a Thanksgiving play or something. He's a real person. He learned English prior to the Pilgrims' arrival because he had been captured by English explorers and spent some time in Europe as a slave. So when he came back, Massasoit, the chief, had him serve as a Pilgrim's translator and guide. So there was a Squanto. So the Continental Congress declared the first national Thanksgiving on December 8th back in 1777. And then in 1789, George Washington declared the last Thursday in November, that familiar day, a national Thanksgiving as well. So these were merely declarations. They weren't official holidays, and future presidents didn't even continue that when Washington started. But when you get to Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln, and this country's in the middle of a civil war, and in 1863 he officially made it a national holiday. He thought maybe it would bring the country together. It was so bitterly divided, and so Thanksgiving took the first official Thanksgiving was there in 1863, and we've celebrated it ever since. But that's the story of Thanksgiving. There's so much more of it, but we're going to look at the map of Plymouth and the surrounds like Cape Cod. After all, this is Fun with Maps. So it all begins in a town called Scrooby. It's a small village located in the county of Nottinghamshire in England. So, okay, here's the United Kingdom. Here's Scotland up here, Edinburgh, Glasgow, the Isle of Man, Wales over here, English Channel, London. Up here is Nottinghamshire. And You've probably heard of Robin Hood. Robin Hood was in the Sherwood Forest. That's here in Nottinghamshire, or Nottingham, the sheriff of Nottingham, all that. So that's where we are, and Scrooby is right in there. So Scrooby was once an important market town, a center for the wool trade. Today it's just a quiet little village. It's only got about 300 people, but it was important because in the early 17th century, they formed a separatist church there. The separatists were a group of religious dissenters. They thought the Church of England was corrupt and it needed reform. So they met at William Brewster's house in Scrooby Manor. We'll hear more about Brewster later. He was one of their leaders. So in 1608, they attempted to flee to Holland to get away from the persecution in England, but they were caught and imprisoned. Eventually, they were able to make it to Holland, and then, of course, later to America, where they founded the Plymouth colony. So they were actually a group of what's called Brownists, and they were just a sect of English Protestant dissenters, and eventually became known as the Pilgrims, and they fled because of religious persecution while they were still in Scrooby. So in 1607, the Archbishop raided their homes and imprisoned several members of the congregation. So, they eventually fled England 1608, and they moved to the Netherlands down here. See how close it is. So they're up here in Nottinghamshire and Scrooby. Netherlands, Holland, it's right there. Okay? So you get some perspective there. Just across here's the channel. So close there. So first they settled in Amsterdam up here, in the capital, all that, crossing the North Sea. Here's Amsterdam. Of course, this is Netherlands, there's Germany, Belgium. We know that. Okay, but then they went down along here to a place called Leiden, or Leiden, Leiden. Okay, and so here it worked out good because they could practice their religion as they chose, but it was very different in the Dutch society there. Scrooby was agricultural. They were farmers, and Leiden is an industrial center, and they didn't like the pace of life that they found there. So the community remained close-knit, but the kids are starting to speak Dutch and adopt Dutch languages and customs, and some even entered the Dutch army, so they didn't like that. And the English crown was still coming after them. English authorities came to Leiden to arrest William Brewster in 1618 because he had published some comments critical of the King of England and the Anglican Church. So Brewster escaped arrest, but the event spurred the congregation to move even farther away from England than the Netherlands. So instead of the Netherlands, they went to what was called the New Netherlands, and that was this 17th century colonial province that the Dutch owned. It's the east coast of what's now, of course, the United States. So there were settlements here in New York and Delaware and New Jersey and Connecticut, and they had posts here in Pennsylvania and Rhode Island as well. So this is a good map. The Dutch settlements. Here's New Amsterdam. Of course, we know that is Manhattan in New York now, but it was originally part of New Netherlands, and it became New Amsterdam. We're going to be looking up here when they arrive, but right now this is the New Netherlands. They decided this is where we're going. Okay, so they got the congregation got a land patent from the Plymouth Company in June 1619. They didn't want to be down here, though, in this New Netherlands. That's where their patent was, because they were kind of tired of the Dutch influence. The Dutch were, one of the reasons they left Holland was the Dutch influence. So this New Netherlands was originally conceived by the Dutch West India Company, 1621. There was a great North American fur trade, so they grew crazy during the 1650s. It was a major center for trade. And there were all kinds of wars and stuff, as you would expect. The Dutch conquered New Sweden, and then there was Anglo-Dutch wars, and the Dutch had to give up New Netherland to the English. The English captured New Amsterdam, which, of course, Manhattan, and then the Dutch took it back, but then they had a treaty, and there were 3 Dutch Anglo Wars and all that. So this, as we know it later on with the 1776, it was all British territory, but it was Dutch here originally. So this is a 1639 map of the area around what was the Noord River and New Amsterdam, which of course is Manhattan. This Noord River is what we now know as the Hudson River. It looks off, and that's because if you look at the legend here, north is going this way. So we have to turn the map. There we go. So here's the Hudson River. There's Manhattan. Here's Staten Island. This is a little more familiar here. So meanwhile, the Pilgrims are obtaining their land patent, and they didn't want to go because of the Dutch influence, but they did allow them to settle at the mouth of the Hudson River, which Noord River here, okay? So the congregation finally boarded a ship. The ship was named Speedwell in July 1620, and they left from the Dutch port of Delfshaven in Rotterdam in South Holland. So they're in this ship called the Speedwell. So this is a painting. It's actually hanging in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda. They painted it in 1843. It's called The Embarkation of the Pilgrims. And if you look down here, you can see the name of the ship here, Speedwell, and the date 1620. So this is when the Pilgrims were leaving on the Speedwell for the New World, and they're in Holland here, and this was actually July 22nd, 1620. And this is William Brewster, who we saw from his home in Scrooby, holding the Bible, and there's Governor Carver and Miles Standish, a familiar name, and they're all praying here. And the artist said that the prominence of women and children in the painting suggests the importance of the family to that community. So they're planning on going to America aboard the Speedwell and another ship called the Mayflower in 1620. So they take off in both ships, but Speedwell was taking on water. It kept leaking, taking on water. They take it back to England. Both ships returned to England. Happened a few times. The Speedwell was then just deemed, it's unseaworthy. So they left it behind, and they sailed on the Mayflower alone. This is a picture of the Mayflower 2 by Old Pine, and it's located in Plymouth Harbor. And they say it's a faithful replica of the original Mayflower. So this is what the Mayflower looked like. So now you've got the Speedwell as unseaworthy. That made some of the passengers say, we're not going to go. And others joined the Mayflower. So it was already heavily burdened, and they're crowding it even more. Some people said that the crew of the Speedwell had intentionally sabotaged the ship because they didn't want to make the treacherous transatlantic voyage. We don't know. So they had these delays while they were working with the Speedwell and all. There were costs of repairs, there were port fees. They had to sell some of their provisions to pay for that. And now it's a late autumn voyage. So, that meant they had to spend the coming winter on board the Mayflower off Cape Cod and in increasingly squally conditions. But anyway, the Mayflower departed Plymouth, England. We saw that on the map on September 6, 1620, with 102 passengers and about 30 crew. And this ship, small ship, 106 feet long. So that's quite a voyage. First month went pretty well. Second month, there were strong North Atlantic winter gales. There's water leakage, a lot of obstacles, seasickness, one man died, the main beam cracked, things like that. So as this picture shows, eventually after 2 months at sea, they sighted land on November 9th, 1620 off the coast of Cape Cod, and here they are. This is actually Plymouth Harbor. So they wanted to sail south to where they're supposed to, at the mouth of the Hudson, but they ran into trouble some of the area, shallow area between Cape Cod and Nantucket Island. Winter was approaching, provisions were running dangerously low, so they decided to return north to Cape Cod Bay and abandon their original landing plans. So this is a postcard from the 1930s of Cape Cod region auto map. So Cape Cod is just a peninsula, this peninsula extending into the Atlantic Ocean, southeast corner of Massachusetts. Okay, let's see what we can see here. Here's Nantucket Sound, Cape Cod Canal, Plymouth is up here, we'll see that soon, Cape Cod Bay, Barnstable Bay, Hyannis Port, some familiar names here and all. But the thing is, when you look at a map or you're describing that, the Cape Cod looks like an arm flexing its biceps. So, you know, here's the hand and bending at the elbow here, and it's, you know, that's Myles Garrett of the Cleveland Browns flexing his bicep there. That's Cape Cod. Okay, so they're still up here in Cape Cod Bay. They're supposed to go down to Hudson, but it was too treacherous and too shallow. So this is a photo from astronauts on the International Space Station. So here you see that arm. Right, so that's Cape Cod. We're going to look at Plymouth up here soon, Boston up there. This is the famous Nantucket Island. This is probably more famous, Martha's Vineyard. So that you can really see this satellite photo from the International Space Station. So Cape Cod extends 65 miles into the Atlantic Ocean here. That's Cape Cod. So, you know, the Pilgrims were not the first Europeans in the area. In 1497, John Cabot discovered Newfoundland, you know, up in Canada, and that's kind of what gave the British all these claims to the east coast of America. So when you look at this map here, it gives you some perspective. So of course, here's the Atlantic Ocean. This is Massachusetts. Here's the modern state of New Hampshire bordering it. Here's Vermont bordering it. Here's New York. Here's Connecticut. Here's Rhode Island. Lexington and Concord, which will feature another 100 years or so. Boston. Martha's Vineyard. Nantucket. And here's Cape Cod, that arm. Cape Cod Bay. And here's Plymouth. So that, and all in the Atlantic Ocean here. That should give you some really good perspective. So Captain John Smith of Jamestown, Virginia, he had explored this area in 1614, and he was the one who named the whole region New England. So where we see Plymouth, he was the one, he gave it the name Accomac because there was a Patuxet settlement there, and that's where the Pilgrims founded Plymouth. But he changed the name to New Plymouth after hearing from Prince Charles, the son of King James. So this map, 1677, again, it's skewed, so we have to turn it. So when we turn it here, okay, there's that familiar arm, and there's the islands, Nantucket, Martha's Vineyard, Cape Cod, and we'll get Plymouth in here and Boston up here, and that's a 1677 map of New England by someone named William Hubbard. And this is Rhode Island and various things. It's an interesting map. But again, they drew it this way. I really like this map. This is by by Hudinsky. So on November 11, 1620, the Mayflower anchored at Provincetown Harbor up here. So it's landed here first in 1620, up here at the tip of the arm. Okay. They didn't have a patent for this area. Remember, they had it for down by the Hudson. And these were religious people and rule followers and all that. And they started to question, hey, we have no legal authority to establish a colony anywhere else. So if we fix up the land and all, we have no guarantee that we'll be able to retain ownership. So on board the ship, they drafted and signed the Mayflower Compact. Okay,
So it's anchored up there, and they draw up this document. It was the first governing document, and it was basically it was written and signed by the 41 male passengers. This map shows where some of the dates where these places were established. So of course, like we say, here's the first landing of the Mayflower up here. Here's Plymouth, 1620. Boston up here in 1630. This was the Massachusetts Bay, border with Massachusetts here. Here's Rhode Island, 1644. Providence, 1633. There's some disputed areas here. Portsmouth, 1639. Dartmouth, 1664. New York down here in 1664. It's just Barnstable. This whole area was called Barnstable for a while. Rochester. It's just a really interesting map. The group is still on board the ship the next day because it's a Sunday, and they're very religious, so they had prayer and worship, and they weren't going to work on a Sunday. So they finally set foot on land at Provincetown that we saw on November 13th, and their first task was to rebuild this shallop, this shallow draft boat. It was built in England, disassembled for transport about the Mayflower, because they had to get from the Mayflower to the land. Actually, you couldn't take, the shallow water, that big ship, all the way. So this is a painting of the landing of the Pilgrims in their shallow boat. So then they used this on November 15th. Captain Miles Standish led a party of 16 men on an exploratory mission, and historically, the following week, a lady named Susanna White gave birth to her son, Peregrine White, on the Mayflower. So he was the first child born to the Pilgrims in the New World, and he was on the Mayflower. So there's no contemporaneous accounts to verify the legend, but everyone says, of course, that Plymouth Rock is hailed as the point where the colonists first set foot on their new homeland. So this is a picture of Plymouth Rock by J.J. Ron. And you can see it's inscribed with the year 1620. That's when they landed in Plymouth, Massachusetts. They formed the Plymouth colony. So here you can see that it was split. Okay. There's a crack, or it was actually split in 1774. The top part was relocated to the town's meeting house, but in 1880 they were joined again together, and that's when they inscribed to 1620. And they also have it where it says Plymouth Rock, Plymouth, Massachusetts, USA. In their writings, the Pilgrims never refer to Plymouth Rock. The first known reference dates to like 1715. When it's described in the town boundary records as, quote, a great rock of all the rocks. So, the first documented claim of Plymouth Rock as landing place of the Pilgrims wasn't made till 1741, 120 years after their arrival. So, that's Plymouth Rock. This is a photo from 1867. There's this monumental canopy that housed the Plymouth Rock until 1920. So like I say, in 1774, it broke in half during an attempt to haul it to the town square, and it was moved to the Pilgrim Hall Museum in 1834, but it was then joined again at the original site here underneath this granite canopy at the original site on the shore of Plymouth Harbor that we see here. So the area where the colonists settled had been identified as New Plymouth in maps that John Smith had published in 1614, and the colonists elected to retain the name for their own settlement because, remember, the final point of departure from England was in Devon and the city of Plymouth. So that stayed as Plymouth. You can see here they're praying. That was the big thing for them, the religious freedom. That's why they left. And of course, there's much more to the story of the Mayflower, the Pilgrims, and Thanksgiving. But this gives you an idea and the fun with maps where Plymouth is, Plymouth Rock, all of that. So again, here's, in our house we use this. We pulled this out for Thanksgiving. We have for years.
A modern Thanksgiving dinner would look very different from what the Pilgrims had at their first Thanksgiving. The colonists didn't have potatoes, so there were no mashed potatoes. There wasn't any butter or flour. They couldn't make pies. They didn't even have their first oven built by the time of the first Thanksgiving. Maybe some cranberries, but it would have been as just a tart thing, not like the sweet sauce that we know and love now. The experts say the feast included fowl and deer and shellfish like mussels and lobsters. They had grapes and plums and corn. Winslow in his writing said that the Native American tribe had killed 5 deer and brought the venison over for the colonists as a gift. They had cabbage, carrots, cucumbers, leeks, lettuce, parsnips, pumpkins, and some wild plants that they had just learned how to cook, like Jerusalem artichokes, garlic, cranberries, Concord grapes, walnuts, and chestnuts. That's from the eyewitness Winslow, who was actually there. So there's no actual proof that the colonists did or did not eat turkey. Turkey really wasn't associated with Thanksgiving until a magazine wrote about it in like the 1840s. So they could have had turkey, probably did, but it wasn't like, the big deal in 1620. So I'm getting hungry talking about all this food, so I'm going to wrap it up. But first I want to say that I'm thankful to you, our viewers and subscribers, for always watching and commenting. So as always, I'm your host, Dan Hansen. Keep on having fun with maps.